What would you do if the very people who raised you stole from you and expected your silence? This is the story of Claire Bennett, a woman who spent her life being the good daughter, the invisible one, until her family crossed the line. When $22,000, 0 cents, vanished from her savings to fund her brother's lavish wedding, Claire made a choice: to fight back. What began as a demand for repayment became a battle to reclaim her voice and expose the deeper patterns of control that had defined her family for decades. Stay tuned, because sometimes the hardest battles are fought around your own family table. Chapter 1: The Wedding That Drained Me. "You can't do anything about it?" my mother sneered. For the first time, I wasn't so sure she was right. I used to believe that blood was thicker than water, that no matter what, family ties would hold through storms, disagreements, even betrayal. But that belief had worn thin, threadbare, after years of being the invisible Bennett, the one expected to smile, to give, and above all, to not make waves. Growing up in the stately Bennett home on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston was like living inside a perfectly curated magazine spread. Immaculate rooms, impeccable manners, and an unspoken hierarchy that placed my younger brother Ryan firmly at the center. My role was never clearly defined, but always understood. The supportive older sister, the one who blended into the background, the one who never asked for too much. My mother, Patricia Bennett, ruled our household with a flawless smile and an iron grip. Father Robert preferred the path of least resistance, which meant letting her run the show. Ryan, he basked in the glow of being the golden child, groomed from birth to inherit my father's wealth and influence. As for me, Claire, I had carved out a modest life away from the marble halls of our family estate. At 31, I had built a career as an event coordinator in Cambridge, scraping together a decent living, planning corporate galas and weddings for clients who valued precision and creativity over opulence. I rented a small but comfortable apartment and had long given up hoping for approval from my parents. But nothing prepared me for the moment when Ryan announced his engagement to Emily Harper, a sweet, well-bred girl whose family owned a string of boutique hotels across New England. My mother beamed with pride. "A perfect match," she declared. "A union of two respected families. This wedding must be nothing short of spectacular." And just like that, the machinery began to turn. At a family dinner one brisk September evening, seated beneath the cold sparkle of the dining room chandelier, I found myself volunteered without consent. "You'll handle the entire design and coordination, of course," Mother said breezily, reaching for her wine glass. "What?" I stammered. "Claire, darling," she continued, voice silky, "with your expertise and connections, it only makes sense. Besides, it would save us the trouble of hiring an outsider, and Ryan's big day deserves every ounce of your attention." Father gave a distracted nod from behind his newspaper. Ryan offered a sheepish smile, clearly unwilling to oppose Mother's plan. Emily looked between us, unsure whether to speak. Before I could gather a coherent response, the conversation had shifted to floral arrangements and the number of courses at the reception dinner. That night, back in my apartment, I stared at my computer screen, my calendar quickly filling with wedding meetings. The initial small favor ballooned within days. Venue scouting, photographer vetting, calligraphy samples, specialty linens, curated welcome baskets for hotel guests. Each item came with an unspoken expectation that I would handle not only the planning but also the upfront costs. "We'll reimburse you, of course," Mother would say dismissively, her tone suggesting it was a mere formality. But I knew better. By early October, I had already sunk over $10,000, 0 cents, of my own savings into the wedding preparations, money I had earmarked for a future down payment on my first condo. Still, I told myself that perhaps, just perhaps, this effort might bridge the chasm between me and my family, that my contributions would finally earn their respect. Yet with every check I wrote, That hope dimmed. The final blow came 2 weeks before the wedding during a planning session at the Langham Hotel. I had carefully curated a floral package within budget. Simple elegance, tasteful arrangements. But as we sat in the grand ballroom, Mother produced her phone and swiped through Pinterest images with Emily leaning in. "Suspended orchid garlands," Mother announced. "Over every table, it'll be divine." "That would triple the floral budget," I said, keeping my voice measured. "Oh, Claire," she chided with a brittle laugh. "Don't be difficult. This is your brother's only wedding. We want it to be unforgettable." Emily nodded hesitantly. Cornered, I agreed to request quotes. Inside, something cracked. That night, alone in my apartment, surrounded by invoices and flower samples, I logged into my bank account and watched the numbers shrink further. The weight of it pressed against my chest. A mounting dread I couldn't shake, and then, as if to punctuate my helplessness, a text from Mother pinged across the screen. "Don't forget to pick up Emily's mother's special breakfast by 7 a.m. No gluten." I stared at the message, heart pounding. My savings were nearly gone, my energy was depleted, and still the demands kept coming. Something had to give. At some point, exhaustion blurs the line between acceptance and surrender. I wasn't sure which side of that line I was on anymore. In the final stretch before the wedding, the demands multiplied like weeds in an unkempt garden. One day it was specialty vegan hors d'oeuvres for Emily's college friends. The next, upgraded Italian linens, because standard cotton won't photograph well, Mother insisted. Each new request came with the same familiar cadence. "We'll reimburse you, of course." I no longer believed it. Still, I paid. I paid because it was easier than fighting. Because each time I opened my mouth to object, Mother's disapproving glance reminded me of decades spent craving her approval. Because somewhere deep down, some childish part of me still hoped that if I just did enough, gave enough, I would finally be seen. And so I worked. I worked through the nights, eyes stinging from lack of sleep. I juggled my regular client load during the day and wedding chaos after hours. My apartment looked like the backstage of a Broadway show. Boxes of embossed stationery, racks of rented glassware, fabric swatches strewn across every surface. My social life dissolved entirely. Friends' texts went unanswered. Calls from Lauren were the only ones I returned. Short bursts of venting over hastily sipped coffee. "You're letting them bleed you dry, Claire," she warned one crisp October afternoon at our usual cafe in Cambridge. "You need to draw a line." "I will," I promised, fingers wrapped tightly around my mug. "Just after the wedding." She gave me a look that said she didn't believe me, and maybe I didn't believe myself either. The night before the big day arrived with a sense of grim inevitability. At the Langham, the ballroom buzzed with activity. Crews installed lighting, hung those damn orchid garlands, blooms so perfect they looked artificial, and so expensive I could barely stand to look at them. I hovered between stations, clipboard in hand, solving problems as they arose. A missing set of custom dessert forks, a misprinted seating chart, the florist running behind schedule. Around 10 p.m., my phone vibrated with a text from Mother. Reminder, gluten-free breakfast for Emily's mom, 7 a.m. sharp. Don't forget. By midnight, the ballroom gleamed, an opulent fairy tale brought to life on the back of my dwindling bank account. I stood alone beneath the suspended orchids, the air thick with the scent of fresh blooms and floor wax. My head throbbed, my feet ached. I should have felt proud. Instead, all I felt was hollow. Returning home, I kicked off my heels and collapsed onto the couch, laptop balanced on my knees. I told myself I'd check one thing, just one, before attempting sleep. I opened my banking app and stared. The number glared back at me, impossibly low. I scrolled through recent transactions, heart rate climbing. The florist, the lighting crew, the welcome baskets. I had expected those. But then, transferred to Patrick Binya Bennett. $8,400.00, 9:17 p.m. The room tilted. My breath caught. I hadn't made that transfer. I hadn't even touched my phone between 9 and 10 p.m. I'd been dealing with the seating chart disaster and calming a panicked Emily. Fingers trembling, I double-checked the timestamp. The details were clear. Damning. 9:17 p.m. Patricia Bennett. My mind reeled. No, this couldn't be real. I had safeguards. My banking app required my PIN, a PIN no one else knew, unless... A sickening thought struck me. My PIN, Ryan's birthday, a number my mother would absolutely know. I dropped the laptop onto the coffee table and buried my face in my hands. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I remembered the words I'd overheard earlier that night, half forgotten until now. She'll never even notice. But I had noticed, and this time I wasn't going to let it go. How could my own mother steal from me and believe I would stay silent? Have you ever trusted someone so deeply only to feel that trust shatter in a single moment? Stay with me, because in Chapter 2, I'll show you exactly what happens when a daughter who's been used for too long finally fights back. Chapter 2, The Transfer. I never made, she'll never even notice. But I did, and this time, I wasn't going to let it slide. Sleep never came that night. I sat frozen on the couch, staring at the $8,400.00 line item that blinked back at me from my banking app. Each digit a punch to the gut. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice again. Patricia Bennett, the mother who had perfected the art of subtle cruelty, whispering those 5 words. She'll never even notice. How long had I let this happen? How many times had I excused her behavior under the banner of family loyalty? But this wasn't misplaced dinner table criticism. This wasn't another backhanded compliment about my career choices. This was theft. By dawn, my mind had morphed from shock to steel. If there was one thing planning high-stakes events had taught me, it was how to think under pressure. I needed evidence. I needed clarity, and more than anything, I needed backup. I started by documenting everything. Screenshots of the transfer, timestamped, a full transaction history from the past 3 months, text messages sent to the band leader at 9:08 p.m. and to the venue coordinator at 9:25 p.m. The clearest proof I hadn't been anywhere near my phone at the time of the transfer. Then came the PIN. 4 digits. Ryan's birthday. It had seemed harmless when I said it years ago. Familiar, easy to remember, but also painfully obvious to a mother who treated privacy like a negotiable term. Around 7 a.m. I brewed the strongest coffee I could manage and texted Lauren, "I need to talk. Urgent." Her reply came seconds later. "My place. Now." By 7:30, I was on her couch, the banking screenshots glowing from my phone as I slid it toward her. Lauren's brow furrowed as she read, "Claire, this is serious." "I know." My voice cracked despite my best effort to sound composed. "She took it. She went into my app and transferred my money without my consent." Lauren exhaled sharply. "You need to confront her. And honestly, you might want to talk to a lawyer first. This is fraud." The word hung heavy between us. Fraud. Somehow hearing it from someone else made it real. Lauren grabbed her phone. "You should call Sophia. She's in family law, remember? I can text her right now." Sophia Walker. We'd gone to Northeastern together. She'd graduated top of her class and now practiced family law in Back Bay. Sharp, strategic, and trustworthy. Moments later, Lauren's phone buzzed. "Sophia says she can meet you this afternoon. She says this is textbook coercion and theft." I nodded, adrenaline dulling the edges of my exhaustion. By noon, I found myself seated across from Sophia at a sunlit corner table of a quiet legal cafe she frequented. No formal office today, just 2 women in need of answers. She listened intently as I laid everything out, the wedding demands, the mounting expenses, the late-night overheard conversation, and the unauthorized transfer. "Claire," she said carefully, "what you're describing isn't just theft. It's financial exploitation within a family context. The law recognizes this. You have options." She opened her leather-bound notebook and began outlining them. A formal demand letter requesting full repayment, plus interest. Documentation of all out-of-pocket expenses I'd covered for the wedding, and a police report prepared to be filed if my mother refused. "What outcome do you want?" she asked softly when she finished. For a moment I hesitated. I could almost hear my mother's voice in my head. "You'll tear this family apart." But as I looked down at the printed transaction list between us, the hesitation evaporated. "I want my money back," I said quietly, "and I want them to know they can't do this to me anymore." Sophia smiled, not unkindly. "Then we begin there." Sophia worked with surgical precision. Over the next hour, she drafted a formal demand letter on her firm's letterhead. The language was measured, legal, but carried an undeniable weight. "You are hereby demanded to return the full sum of $8,400.00, as well as all additional wedding expenses paid by Claire Bennett in good faith under duress, totaling $22,786.00, within 48 hours of receipt of this letter. Failure to comply will result in immediate filing of a police report for theft and fraud and pursuit of all available legal remedies." The words sent a quiet thrill through me. Not spite, not revenge, but a long overdue assertion of boundaries I had never dared to claim. "Claire," Sophia said gently as she placed the printed letter into a crisp white envelope, "you should be prepared. This will cause an explosion, but it's your right, and frankly, it's long overdue." I exhaled, tension still coiled tight inside me. "I know. I'm ready. At least, I hoped I was." I left the cafe with the envelope tucked securely in my bag. The cool autumn wind along Boylston Street bit through my coat, but for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to clarity. Later that evening, back in my apartment, I spread every piece of evidence across my small dining table. Receipts, credit card statements, printed email chains, screenshots of text messages, all neatly categorized and ready to present if needed. I wasn't just fighting for the money anymore. I was fighting for myself. Lauren came over, her eyes widening at the sight. "Wow," she whispered. "You really documented everything." I had to. My voice was calm now. "I'm not letting them dismiss this as some misunderstanding." We rehearsed what I would say. Lauren role-played my mother's predictable responses: gaslighting, guilt-tripping, veiled threats about damaging the family's reputation. "Remember," she reminded me, "you're not the one who broke trust. You're the one holding them accountable." I nodded, the words anchoring me. By midnight, the envelope lay on my nightstand, ready for tomorrow's confrontation at the post-wedding brunch. I barely slept. My mind cycled through worst-case scenarios: angry shouting matches, cold stares, accusations of betrayal. But woven through the anxiety was something new: resolve. Morning came too quickly. I dressed deliberately: a navy blue blazer, tailored black pants, simple pearl earrings, my version of armor. As I locked my apartment door, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. For the first time in years, I didn't see the dutiful, overlooked daughter. I saw a woman about to claim her power. The Bennett house looked as pristine as ever when I arrived. White columns, manicured hedges, the flagstone path lined with autumn wreaths. Inside, the air buzzed with the post-wedding glow. Laughter spilled from the sunroom where the brunch was already underway. I paused in the foyer, hand tightening around my bag. "You can do this," I whispered to myself. Then I stepped inside. My mother spotted me first. "Claire, finally. We were about to start without you. Brunch is getting cold." I smiled thinly. Sorry I'm late. I had some banking issues to sort out this morning. A flicker crossed her face. Quick, guarded, she recovered smoothly. Well, you're here now. Grab a mimosa. The spread was lavish, of course. Smoked salmon, eggs Benedict, fresh berries, pastries from some overpriced bakery in Beacon Hill. I filled a plate I knew I wouldn't eat. My stomach was too tight. For 20 agonizing minutes, I endured small talk about how beautiful the ceremony had been, how stunning the orchids looked. "Patricia, you outdid yourself," one of the Harper relatives gushed. "Nothing but the best for our only son," my mother beamed. That was my opening. "Speaking of the best," I said calmly, setting my plate down, "I noticed something interesting when I checked my bank account this morning." The room shifted. Forks paused mid-air. Conversation stilled. I looked directly at my mother. There was a transfer made last night. $8,400, 0 cents. From my account to yours. Her smile froze. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, Claire," she said lightly, but her eyes betrayed her. I reached into my bag and withdrew the envelope. "Then perhaps you'll understand after reading this." I placed it on the table. "You have 48 hours. What happens when a family built on appearances is forced to face the truth, right in front of their carefully chosen guests? Have you ever had to stand alone in a room full of people, knowing that speaking up could shatter everything you've ever known? Join me in Chapter 3, because sometimes the most polite family gatherings hide the ugliest betrayals. And today, no one will leave this table unchanged. Chapter 3. The confrontation they didn't expect. I'm not the family ATM anymore, and I brought receipts. The envelope sat in the center of the table, an unspoken threat wrapped in crisp white paper. The moment I laid it down, the air shifted. Conversation halted. Champagne flutes remained suspended mid-air. The clink of silverware abruptly silenced. Across from me, my mother's smile faltered. Not a crack, not yet, but a subtle tightening at the corners. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, Claire," she repeated, voice airy, brittle. I didn't look away. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. $8,400, 0 cents, transferred from my account to yours, last night, without my knowledge, without my consent." A low murmur rippled through the sunroom. Ryan's head snapped up from his plate. Emily froze, fork halfway to her mouth. Across the room, Mr. and Mrs. Harper exchanged uneasy glances. My father folded his newspaper with deliberate slowness, the rustle sounding unnaturally loud. "Perhaps this isn't the appropriate time or place for this discussion," he said gruffly. "When would be appropriate, Dad?" I countered, voice steady. "When I'm not around? When it can be swept under the rug like everything else?" Patricia's eyes flashed. "Claire, you're being dramatic. If there was a transfer, it was obviously for wedding expenses we previously discussed." "We never discussed me paying for your honeymoon upgrade?" Gasps. Emily's gaze darted toward Ryan. I pressed on. "I overheard you in the office last night, Mom. You said she'll never even notice. You knew exactly what you were doing." For a heartbeat, her mask slipped, then her chin lifted defiantly. "Fine. Yes, I made the transfer. The money was needed. You were being difficult about the additional costs. I did what was necessary." "Necessary?" I echoed softly. "Stealing from your own daughter was necessary?" My father's face darkened. "Patricia?" But she pressed on, voice rising. "It's not as if you were using that money for anything important. This was your brother's wedding. Our family's reputation was at stake." There it was, the truth laid bare in front of everyone. I inhaled sharply, willing my hands to stay steady. "I've already contributed nearly $22,000, 0 cents to this wedding," I said. "Money I saved for years, for my own future, and you took more without asking. That's theft, and this," I gestured to the envelope, is a formal demand for repayment. You have 48 hours. Silence. Then Emily's voice, tentative but clear. 22,000? Ryan looked stricken. Mom told me Claire was just helping with a few small things, that the company was covering most of it. My mother waved a dismissive hand. Claire likes to exaggerate. She's always been sensitive. I had prepared for this. Calmly, I reached into my bag and pulled out a neatly organized folder, placing it next to the envelope. Receipts, invoices, every expense documented. The orchid garlands, me. The welcome baskets, me. The upgraded cocktail hour, me. The photographer, me. My father reached for the folder, flipping through its contents with increasing unease. This, he began, voice tight. This is serious, Patricia. It's a bluff, my mother said quickly, though her voice had lost its usual sheen of confidence. It's not a bluff, I said quietly. And if you refuse to return what you stole, I will file a police report. The Langham has security footage of who entered and exited the office last night. I've already requested it. Another ripple of shock. Mr. Harper cleared his throat, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Perhaps we should give your family some privacy, he began. No, I said firmly. Please stay. I'd like witnesses for this conversation. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ryan finally found his voice. Mom, did you really take Claire's phone and transfer money without asking her? Patricia glared at him. I did what was necessary for this family. I met her gaze without flinching. No. You did what was necessary for your image, and you did it by stealing from me. The room felt like it had frozen in place. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, loud against the brittle silence that followed my words. Across from me, my mother's eyes blazed with thinly veiled fury, but beneath the indignation a flicker of something else pulsed. You're blowing this completely out of proportion, Claire, she said, her tone clipped. This is a family matter. We don't air such things in front of guests. I didn't blink. You made it a legal matter the moment you stole from me. Emily set her fork down carefully. Her voice, usually soft, was now laced with resolve. I had no idea, Claire. I'm so sorry. If I had known... It's not your fault, I said, meeting her gaze. I could see the genuine distress in her eyes. This was as much a betrayal to her as it was to me. My father continued flipping through the folder, expression hardening with every page. Patricia, he said finally, voice lower now. She's not exaggerating. Everything here is documented. So what? My mother's voice rose, brittle and sharp. She was supposed to help her brother. That's what family does. She's always so transactional about everything, always keeping score. I kept score because none of you would, I said, voice steady, despite the ache building in my chest. Because you've spent a lifetime expecting me to give without question. Ryan looked stricken. Mom, you told me most of this was covered by the family or Emily's parents. You said Claire was happy to contribute a few small things. Patricia's eyes flicked toward him, her mask finally cracking. I said what needed to be said. So, lying was necessary too. Ryan's voice shook with disbelief. Claire spent her savings for this wedding, and you still took more without asking her. My father set the folder down with a weary sigh. Enough, he said firmly. This isn't going away, Patricia. We need to handle it properly. For a moment, my mother looked genuinely cornered, her gaze darting between my father, Ryan, and me. The carefully cultivated image of control she had built was unraveling. You wouldn't dare take this to the police, she hissed, leaning forward. Think of what this would do to the family name, to Ryan and Emily's reputation. I met her stare, unflinching. You should have thought of that before you stole from me. Another ripple of tension moved through the room. I could feel every pair of eyes on us. Guests, relatives, even the house staff lingering in the doorway, pretending not to listen. Then, softly, Emily spoke again. Claire is right, she said, voice trembling but firm. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was wrong, and I won't start my marriage with this kind of deception hanging over us." Ryan looked at her, then back at me. His face was pale, conflicted, but there was resolve now in his eyes too. "We need to make this right, Mom," he said quietly. "All of it." My mother's face flushed crimson. "You can't possibly—" "I can," Ryan cut in, stronger now, "and I will. The money will be returned. All of it. Claire deserves better." My father nodded, voice gruff. "Agreed. Patricia, this is serious. We'll handle it. Now." For a moment, I almost felt a pang of sympathy. Almost. But sympathy had no place here. Not anymore. "You have 48 hours, I said one final time, rising from my chair. "And know this, if I don't see every cent back where it belongs, I will file the report. And I won't stop there." As I turned to leave, my mother's voice rang out, desperate now. "Claire, don't do this. You'll regret it." I paused, hand on the doorframe. "No, Mother," I said softly. "The only thing I regret is that it took me this long to stand up to you." And with that, I walked out into the crisp October air, heart pounding, but head held high. Will Patricia really return the money? Or will she find a new way to protect the perfect image she's built? Have you ever risked losing everything just to finally speak your truth? Stay with me in Chapter 4, because sometimes the hardest battle isn't the confrontation. It's surviving the silence that comes after. Chapter 4, the 48-hour deadline. If they think I won't go through with this, they haven't been paying attention. The door closed behind me with a soft but decisive thud. I stood for a moment on the wide stone steps of the Bennett house, my breath clouding in the crisp October air. Inside, the weight of generations, the expectations, the unspoken rules, had finally cracked. But outside, I wasn't sure yet what waited for me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. "Lauren, how did it go?" Her text read. I stared at the screen for a beat before typing back. I dropped the letter, gave them 48 hours. Patricia looked ready to combust. A moment later, her reply came through. "Proud of you. Now hold the line. Call me later." I would. But first, I needed to think. Back at my apartment, I made a beeline for the coffee maker. Sleep had been impossible the past few nights. I didn't expect the coming hours to be any different. The Bennetts would react. I just didn't know how. Patricia's instinct was always to control the narrative, to spin any situation in her favor. Robert, for all his quiet authority, tended to follow her lead, unless forced otherwise. And now, with their facade cracked in front of guests, the stakes had shifted. I poured myself a mug and settled onto the couch, the folder of receipts and evidence still on the coffee table, a silent reminder of the battle underway. By noon, my email chimed. A single line from my father. "We will review your letter. Please allow us time to respond." No apology, no acknowledgement, but it wasn't a refusal. Yet. I forwarded the message to Sophia. Minutes later, my phone rang. "He's buying time," she said bluntly. "That's fine, for now. But if they don't meet your demand within 48 hours, we proceed exactly as planned." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. "Understood. And Claire," she added, her voice softening, "you did the hard part already. Now your job is to stand firm. No contact. No backpedaling." "I won't," I promised. But holding that line proved harder than I'd thought. That evening, as twilight fell over Cambridge, my phone rang again. "Ryan?" I stared at the screen, debating. Then, with a sigh, I answered. "Claire? Can we talk?" His voice was quieter than usual. "We are talking," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I didn't know," he rushed on. About the money, about how much you'd spent. Mom kept saying you wanted to help, that you were fine with everything. I wasn't fine, Ryan, and she knew it. Silence. Then, I believe you. I do. And I want to fix this. The admission caught me off guard. I could hear the guilt in his voice, raw and unpolished in a way I rarely heard from him. It's not your responsibility to fix, I said softly, but I appreciate that you finally see it. I want to help, he insisted. If Mom and Dad don't return the money, I will. Emily agrees. We'll do whatever it takes. Another unexpected shift. Thank you, I managed, throat tight. But right now, I need to let them face this themselves. No more shielding, no more excuses. Understood, Ryan said. But you're not alone in this anymore, Claire. Not this time. As the call ended, I sat staring at the darkening sky outside my window. For the first time in weeks, a sliver of warmth pierced the cold resolve inside me. But I couldn't afford to relax. Not yet. The clock was ticking. The first night was the hardest. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The silence of my apartment louder than any words spoken that morning. My mind replayed every moment of the confrontation. My mother's brittle defiance, my father's unreadable expression, Ryan's shock, Emily's whispered apology. The envelope was no longer just paper. It was a line drawn in the sand. By the second morning, the adrenaline had worn thin, replaced by a simmering exhaustion. My phone remained mercifully quiet. No calls from Patricia, no more emails from Robert. That alone unsettled me more than if they'd called in anger. Silence, I knew, was one of my mother's sharpest weapons. She was biding her time, calculating her next move. I busied myself with work, answering client emails, drafting event timelines, but each task felt like a flimsy distraction. Every glance at the clock reminded me of the ticking deadline. At noon, Sophia checked in. No news. Is still progress, she reminded me. It means they're taking this seriously. Hold steady. Trying, I admitted. Around 3, the first crack appeared. An unexpected visitor. Emily. She stood at my door, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes earnest. I hope this isn't overstepping, she said as I let her in. But I needed to see you. I gestured toward the couch, unsure what to expect. Ryan told me everything, she began. About the money, about what your mother did, and I want you to know, I believe you. I'm ashamed I didn't question things sooner. Her voice trembled. You couldn't have known, I said softly. Patricia controls the narrative. She always has. That's going to change, Emily said, steel beneath the warmth. Ryan and I talked. We're with you in this. Completely. I exhaled, some of the weight on my chest easing. Thank you. That means more than I can say. We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, the tension in my body finally beginning to thaw. Then, my phone buzzed. An email. From Robert. My breath caught. Emily squeezed my hand. You should read it, she urged. Fingers trembling, I opened it. Claire, the message began. The funds will be returned in full. With interest. I've instructed our accountant to process the transfer today. I hope we can begin to mend what has been damaged. Dad. I stared at the words, reading them twice, then a third time. It's happening, I whispered. Emily's smile was small but genuine. You did this. You stood up, and they couldn't ignore you. Relief mingled with something sharper. Resolve. This wasn't the end. Not yet. As Emily left, promising to stay in touch, I finally allowed myself to breathe. That evening I poured a glass of wine, my first in weeks, and sat by the window watching the city lights flicker to life. The money would be back. The threat of legal action had worked. But as I sipped, a new question surfaced. Was reclaiming what was mine enough? Or was this the moment to dismantle the entire web of control my mother had built? Sophia's words echoed in my mind. Now the money's back. But do you want to stop here or change the game for good? I stared out at the darkened skyline, heart steady, mind clear. Maybe it was time to change the game. Now that the money is returning, will Claire choose to walk away or finally expose the deeper rot within her family? Have you ever faced the moment where reclaiming what was yours no longer felt like enough, and you knew it was time to seek true justice? Join me in Chapter 5, because sometimes winning the first battle only reveals just how far you still have to go to truly break free. The transformation. The family that calls silenced me. This family thrives on secrets. Maybe it's time they lost that power. The money appeared in my account just after 9 a.m. the next morning. I sat at my kitchen table, cup of black coffee cooling in my hands, staring at the notification blinking on my phone. Transfer received, $22,786.00 plus interest. From R. Bennett. It was done, on paper at least, the balance restored, the threat of legal action neutralized. But sitting there watching that number reclaim the space it had once occupied, I felt nothing. No triumph, no relief, because the fight had never really been about the money. Not truly. It was about the years I had spent silencing myself to preserve their version of the truth, about the way Patricia had manipulated every relationship around her, weaving a web so tight that even I had believed for far too long that I deserved my place beneath it. And now, finally, there was a tear in that web. Sophia had warned me this moment would come. Once you win the first round, Claire, you'll face a choice. Restore the status quo or change the entire game. I knew what choice I had to make, but I wasn't going to do it alone. That afternoon, I met Lauren and Sophia at a small cafe in Back Bay. Quiet, with heavy brick walls and worn leather booths that seemed to absorb sound. I got the transfer confirmation, I told them over steaming mugs of chai. It's done, but I'm not walking away. Lauren leaned in. Good. Neither should you. Sophia nodded. Then we go public. Selectively at first. You tell your story, you control the narrative, before Patricia can spin it. You think she will? I asked, though I already knew the answer. She's probably already trying, Sophia said dryly, but facts are powerful things, and so is your voice, Claire. That voice still felt unfamiliar in this new, sharper form, but it was growing stronger. Where do we start? I asked. Sophia pulled out a small notepad. You draft a personal statement, we'll review it together, then you publish it. Blog, social media, wherever you feel comfortable. We position it carefully, not an attack but an honest account of your experience, your truth. Lauren reached across the table, her hand warm over mine. Claire, you've already done the impossible. Now you're about to help more people than you know. Her words caught me off guard. More people? I echoed. You're not the only one with a family like this, she said softly. Trust me. A tight knot I hadn't realized was there loosened in my chest. By the time we left the cafe, the late afternoon light had faded to soft gray. I walked home through the quiet streets of Boston, the wind cool against my face, pulse steady beneath my coat. That night, I opened my laptop and stared at the blank page for a long time. Then, slowly, the words began to flow. I've spent most of my life believing that silence kept the peace, that speaking out would only bring shame or worse. But there comes a moment when silence becomes the greater betrayal, not just of ourselves, but of the truth. The words poured out, raw and unpolished, but real. I didn't know what the response would be. I only knew I had to speak, and this time no one, not even Patricia Bennett, could silence me. I stared at the draft on my laptop screen late into the night, the soft hum of the city beyond my window, the only sound in the room. I've spent most of my life believing that silence kept the peace. The words felt like an exhale after years of holding my breath. I sent the draft to Sophia and Lauren. Moments later, both replied, "It's perfect. Post it when you're ready." I wasn't sure one could ever feel fully ready for this kind of exposure, but deep down, I knew it was time. The next morning, under a pale autumn sky, I took a deep breath and clicked publish. The post went live on my professional blog first, where former clients and peers would see it. Then I shared it quietly on my personal social media. No hashtags, no dramatics, just truth. Then I waited. At first, nothing. Then a trickle of notifications, comments, private messages. A former college friend messaged, "Thank you for writing this. I never had the words to say what you just did." An acquaintance from an old event planning job. "My mother controlled me with money for years. Your post gave me courage." Dozens more followed. Some were from strangers, women from all corners of the country who had read and recognized their own stories in mine. Lauren was right. I wasn't alone. By early afternoon, the post had been shared over 200 times, and then the text came. "We need to talk. Immediately. Patricia Bennett." I let the phone ring. A second text arrived minutes later. "You've embarrassed this family. Take that post down now." I could almost hear her voice behind the words. Tight, furious, desperate to regain control. But she was too late. The truth was already out. An hour later, I received a message from a local journalist, a woman named Elise Grant, who ran a popular column on family dynamics and financial abuse in the Boston Globe. "Claire," she wrote, "I read your post. Would you be willing to speak further? Many women deal with this, and your story could help countless others." I forwarded the message to Sophia. Her reply was swift. "If you're comfortable, do it. You control the terms. Public accountability matters." For a moment, I hesitated, old reflexes tugging at me, whispering to stay small, to avoid further fallout. But I had come too far to shrink back now. "Yes," I wrote back to Elise. "I'd be willing to speak." That evening, over tea at Lauren's apartment, I told her everything. "I'm proud of you," she said, eyes bright. "You're not just taking your power back, you're giving it to others too." "I hope so," I whispered. We toasted quietly, the clink of our mugs a soft, defiant sound against the shadows of the past. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed one last time. Another email, this time from Patricia. "This is your final warning. Take the post down or there will be consequences." I stared at the screen, my pulse calm and steady. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of her threats. And as I powered off my phone, a new notification caught my eye. An email from Elise. "Claire, the Globe is moving forward with your story. We'd like to schedule an interview for tomorrow. Are you available?" I smiled to myself, heart racing. Not with fear, but with something stronger. "Yes," I typed back. "I'm ready." What will happen when Claire's story goes public, and how far will Patricia go to silence her once more? Have you ever reached the moment where telling your truth mattered more than protecting the very people who tried to break you? Stay with me in Chapter 6, because sometimes the real freedom isn't just walking away from the past. It's standing tall when the whole world is finally watching. Chapter 6. The life I chose. I didn't lose a family. I lost a cage. The Boston Globe published the story on a brisk November morning. The headline was simple but unmistakable. "When family control crosses the line, a daughter's story of financial exploitation and silence." I sat at my kitchen counter, mug of coffee trembling slightly between my hands, watching as the article went live on the front page of their Family and Society section. My name, my story, in black and white for the world to see. The piece was balanced, respectful. Elise had done justice to my words. It included excerpts from my blog post, careful legal commentary from Sophia, and statistics on financial abuse within families. Too often, it read, victims of such exploitation remained silent, fearing shame or isolation. Claire Bennett chose another path. For the first time in my life, I felt seen, not as the dutiful daughter, not as the convenient scapegoat, but as myself. And I wasn't alone. By noon, my inbox was overflowing. Messages from strangers, friends, former colleagues. Women from every corner of the country wrote to say, "Me too. Your story gave me courage. I never thought anyone would say this out loud. Thank you for speaking for all of us who still can't." The sheer volume of it humbled me. Lauren called mid-afternoon. "Claire," she said, voice thick with emotion. "Do you realize what you've done? You're giving people permission to speak, to fight back." "I didn't set out to be anyone's voice," I admitted. "I just couldn't stay quiet anymore." "And that," she replied, "is exactly why it matters." But not everyone shared that sentiment. By evening, a new email arrived, short, clipped. "You have embarrassed this family enough. There will be consequences. Patricia Bennett." I stared at it, pulse steady. There was a time when those words would have gutted me, would have sent me spiraling into guilt and self-doubt. Not now. I forwarded the email to Sophia without a second thought. Her reply came moments later, standard intimidation. "Do not engage." I wouldn't, because the moment I'd published my story, I had crossed a threshold I couldn't and wouldn't retreat from. That night, alone in my apartment, I poured a glass of wine and opened the small box I had kept tucked away for months. A simple key with a navy ribbon tied to it. The key to my new condo. A space entirely my own. I'd put the deposit down 2 weeks earlier, before the article, before the final confrontation, a private act of reclaiming my future. Now, as I held the key in my hand, it meant something more. Not just freedom from my mother's grasp, but the freedom to define my life on my own terms. I set the key down carefully, a small smile tugging at my lips. Then my phone buzzed again, an unfamiliar number this time. "Claire, this is Sarah Williams from Women's Voices podcast. We'd love to feature you in an upcoming episode about breaking free from toxic family dynamics. Would you be open to a conversation?" I read the message twice. Another threshold, another choice. My hand hovered over the keyboard for a moment. Then I typed yes. I'd be honored. Because this time, I wasn't stepping back into silence. I was stepping forward. I didn't sleep much that night. But for once, it wasn't from dread. It was possibility. The emails, the podcast invitation, the messages from strangers. They weren't noise. They were proof that the power Patricia had wielded for so long was cracking. By the next afternoon, Elise forwarded me another request. "Claire, we've had interest from Boston Living, a feature on local voices making an impact. No pressure, but it could be another platform for your message." The old reflexes still tugged. "Keep quiet. Don't draw more attention." But I silenced them. "Yes," I replied. "I'm ready." That evening, I met Ryan and Emily for coffee in Beacon Hill. Ryan looked different, not the careless younger brother I'd watched glide through life on charm and entitlement, but someone beginning to see the cost of the pedestal he'd stood on. "Claire," he said earnestly, "I'm sorry, truly, for not seeing it sooner, for going along with Mom, for benefiting from it." I studied him for a moment. There was no defensiveness, no excuses. "I believe you," I said simply, "but it's not about me forgiving you. It's about what you do now." He nodded. "I know. Emily and we're done playing by her rules. We've started therapy, and if she retaliates, we won't stand by." For the first time, I believed him. As we parted, Emily hugged me tightly. "You're stronger than any of us knew," she whispered. "You gave us permission to see it, too." Later that week, I stood in my new condo, sunlight streaming through wide windows, cardboard boxes still half unpacked. It was mine, every inch of it free from my mother's taste, her scrutiny, her reach. I ran my fingers along the kitchen counter, the cool stone grounding me. You earned this, I told myself softly. You chose this. Because this wasn't just a new address, it was a declaration. I am no longer who you shaped me to be. The podcast interview went live 2 weeks later, my voice steady, measured, telling the story I had once buried so deep, and the response was overwhelming. More women wrote, a few men too. People who had spent lifetimes in the shadow of family control, now daring to imagine freedom. Lauren and I celebrated quietly over dinner one night. "You've started something bigger than you know," she said, raising her glass. I smiled. "I'm ready for it." But not everyone was ready to let go. A thin, cream-colored envelope arrived one crisp December morning. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of heavy paper, written in Patricia's elegant, cold hand. "You've made your point. Stop now, or the next consequences won't be legal. Family can make life very uncomfortable. Consider this your last warning." My hands didn't shake as I folded the letter. Instead, I photographed it, sent it to Sophia, and carefully slid it into a new folder. Evidence. Ongoing threats. This wasn't fear anymore, it was documentation. And then, as I sipped my coffee, another email pinged, this time from a national magazine. "Claire, we read your interview. We'd like to feature your story in our January issue on reclaiming personal power. Would you be willing?" I stared at the screen. Patricia's world thrived on shadows, but I had stepped into the light, and now others were watching. "Yes," I typed, pulse calm. "I'm not done yet. Thank you so much for watching this story. If Claire's journey resonated with you, even in the smallest way, know this: you are not alone. Far too many of us have been taught to stay silent in the face of family pressure and control. But silence only protects those who abuse trust. Speaking your truth takes courage, setting boundaries takes strength, and reclaiming your life is always worth it. If this story inspired you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And remember, your worth is never defined by the expectations of others. You have the right to choose the life you want.